Have you ever looked at an old photograph and felt something wasn't quite right? Today, we're diving into the story of a seemingly innocent picture from 1913 that has puzzled historians, photographers, and paranormal researchers for decades. What starts as a simple portrait of a young boy with his favorite toy becomes something far more disturbing when you look closer at what's lurking in the shadows behind him. Before we begin, if you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. The autumn rain hammered against the windows of the Historical Preservation Society in Boston, Massachusetts, creating a rhythmic backdrop to Dr. Eleanor Hayes's meticulous work. It was October 2019, and she had been cataloging donations for the Society's archive for nearly 6 months. Most items were predictable: Civil War letters, Victorian-era portraits, Depression-era documents. But on this particular Tuesday afternoon, as the grey light filtered through the tall windows, Eleanor opened a leather-bound album that would change everything. The album had been donated by the estate of Margaret Whitmore, a woman who had passed away at 103 years old in a nursing home in Salem. According to the accompanying paperwork, Margaret had been a collector of antiques and had no living relatives. Her collection was substantial, but this particular album had been found in a locked drawer in her bedroom, separate from her main collection. Eleanor carefully turned the brittle pages, each one protected by delicate tissue paper. The photographs were typical of the early 1900s. Stiff, formal portraits, family gatherings, children in their Sunday best. But then she reached page 17 and her hand froze mid-turn. The photograph showed a boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, standing in what appeared to be a parlor. He wore a simple white shirt with suspenders, knickers, and leather boots that came up to his calves. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he held a wooden toy soldier in his small hands. The boy's smile was genuine and bright, the kind of unguarded joy that children of that era rarely showed in photographs, given the long exposure times required. But it wasn't the boy that made Eleanor's breath catch. It was what stood behind him. In the background, partially obscured by the heavy curtains that framed a window, there was a figure. At first glance, it appeared to be another person, perhaps an adult standing in the shadows. But as Eleanor leaned closer, adjusting her magnifying glass, the details became increasingly disturbing. The figure was tall, unnaturally thin, and its posture was wrong somehow. The angle of the head, the length of the limbs, the way it seemed to blend with the shadows, while simultaneously standing apart from them. Eleanor photographed the image with her high-resolution camera and immediately uploaded it to her computer. Using digital enhancement tools, she began to examine every pixel. The more she zoomed in, the more questions arose. The figure's face, if it had one, was completely obscured by darkness. Yet there seemed to be eyes, 2 lighter spots that could have been reflections or could have been something else entirely. She checked the back of the photograph. Written in faded brown ink was a single line: Thomas Blackwell, May 1913, taken 1 week before. Before what? The sentence ended abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted or had chosen not to complete the thought. Eleanor spent the rest of the afternoon researching. She found census records for several Thomas Blackwells in Massachusetts in 1913, but none with a clear connection to Salem. The photographic studio mark on the bottom right corner of the image had been partially torn away, leaving only Kins, Photography, Sa. As the October evening darkened outside, Eleanor made copies of the photograph and locked the original back in the archive vault. She couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes in the shadow were watching her, even through the digital screen. That night, she barely slept. When she did drift off, she dreamed of old parlors and figures that stood too still in doorways. If you're enjoying the video so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps me continue bringing you these mysterious stories. Dr. Eleanor Hayes wasn't the type to believe in ghosts or supernatural phenomena. She had a doctorate in American history from Harvard and had spent 15 years working with historical documents and photographs. She understood how light could play tricks, how old film could create artifacts, how the human brain was wired to see faces in random patterns. But the photograph of Thomas Blackwell troubled her in ways she couldn't quite articulate. The following morning, with strong coffee and renewed determination, Eleanor contacted several colleagues. First was Dr. Marcus Webb, a photography historian at MIT who specialized in early 20th century photographic techniques. She sent him the high-resolution scans without context, asking only for his professional analysis. His response came within hours. "Eleanor, where did you find this? The photograph is genuine, no signs of double exposure or manipulation. The emulsion is consistent with 1913 film stock, but that figure in the background, I've never seen shadow distortion quite like that. Can we meet?" They met that afternoon in Marcus's cluttered office, where walls were covered with examples of historical photography techniques. Marcus had already printed several enlarged versions of the photograph, each one showing different aspects of the mysterious figure. "Look at the light source," Marcus said, pointing to the window in the photograph. "Natural daylight coming from the left. Probably mid-morning based on the angle. The boy is properly illuminated, the shadows fall correctly. But this figure," he tapped the enlargement, "it's absorbing light rather than reflecting it. That shouldn't be possible with the film technology of 1913. Eleanor pulled out her notes. "I found a Thomas Blackwell in the 1910 census. He was born in 1904, which would make him about 9 in this photograph. Family lived on Hawthorne Street in Salem. Father was a mill worker, mother died in 1911. But here's the strange part. I can't find any record of Thomas after May 1913. Marcus leaned back in his chair. "He disappeared. Either that or the family moved, and he's recorded under a different name. But given what's written on the back of the photograph," Eleanor showed him her transcription of the message. "Taken 1 week before," Marcus read aloud. "That's ominous as hell." Over the next several days, Eleanor dove deeper into Salem's historical records. She visited the local historical society, spoke with genealogists, and combed through newspaper archives. What she found painted a picture of a town dealing with its own darkness. Salem in 1913 was struggling. The textile mills that had once thrived were shutting down, jobs were disappearing, and families were desperate. The city's newspapers from that spring and summer were filled with troubling stories. Missing children, unexplained deaths, a series of house fires that the authorities couldn't explain. And Thomas Blackwell's name appeared in one small article, dated May 24, 1913. The headline read, "Local boy missing, family seeks information." The article was brief. "Thomas Blackwell, age 9 of Hawthorne Street, has not been seen since May 18th. The boy was last observed playing in his family's yard in the early morning. His father, Robert Blackwell, asks that anyone with information contact the Salem Police Department. A reward is offered. May 18th, 1913. If the photograph had been taken 1 week before, that would place it around May 11th. Eleanor found 2 more articles from June and July of that year, each one shorter than the last, documenting the continued search for Thomas. Then nothing. The story simply disappeared from the public record. She shared her findings with Marcus, who had been conducting his own research into the photography studio. He'd managed to identify it as Perkins Photography, a small studio that had operated in Salem from 1898 to 1915. "I found something else," Marcus said during their phone call. Jonathan Perkins, the owner, left Salem abruptly in 1913, closed his studio, moved to New York. I tracked down his grandson, who's still alive and living in Vermont. He's willing to talk to us. Leave a comment below about what you think happened to Thomas. I love hearing your theories. The drive to Burlington, Vermont took 4 hours through winding roads lined with autumn foliage. Eleanor and Marcus arrived at a modest assisted living facility just as the afternoon sun began its descent. Robert Perkins, 87 years old, sat in a sunroom overlooking a small garden. His hands trembled slightly as he held the photograph they'd brought. "I've never seen this picture," Robert said slowly, his voice rough with age. "But I know the story. My grandfather made me promise never to talk about it, but hell, everyone involved is dead now. Maybe it's time." He set the photograph on the table between them, careful not to look at it directly. My grandfather, Jonathan Perkins, was a respected photographer in Salem. Did portraits, weddings, family pictures. He was good at his work, meticulous. But in the spring of 1913, something changed. He started drinking, became paranoid, wouldn't let anyone into his dark room. Robert paused, reaching for a glass of water with shaking hands. My father was 16 then, working as my grandfather's assistant. He told me that in May of that year, a man came into the studio with his son, Robert Blackwell, and his boy Thomas. They wanted a simple portrait, something Thomas could send to relatives. My grandfather set up the shot in his studio, which was in their house on Essex Street. The session went normally. Thomas was a cheerful kid, excited about the toy soldier his father had bought him. My grandfather took several photographs, but when he developed them that evening, he called my father into the darkroom. My father said he'd never seen my grandfather so shaken. Eleanor leaned forward. What did he see? Every single photograph had it, the figure in the background. My grandfather swore up and down that there had been no one else in the room. He was certain. My father confirmed it. It had been just the three of them. But there it was, in every single shot, this tall, dark shape standing in the corner of the room, always slightly out of focus, always in the shadows. Marcus interrupted. "Could it have been a problem with the camera or the film?" Robert shook his head. "That's what my grandfather thought at first. He took test photographs all through the house. Nothing unusual. But here's the thing that really scared him. The figure was only visible in photographs taken in that specific room, and only when certain people were in the frame." "Certain people?" Eleanor asked. "Children," Robert said quietly. "My grandfather tested it. He had my father stand in that room, took a photograph, nothing unusual. Then he had a neighbor's daughter, maybe 10 years old, stand in the same spot. There it was again, the figure. The elderly man's hands had stopped trembling, but his face had gone pale. My grandfather was terrified. He gave the Blackwell family one photograph, probably the one you have there, but he burned all the others. He told Robert Blackwell that there had been a problem with the rest of the film. A few days later, he heard that Thomas had disappeared. Did your grandfather think the photograph had something to do with it? Eleanor asked carefully. He never said it outright, but yes, I think he did. He told my father that whatever was in that room had been there all along, invisible to the naked eye, but somehow captured on film. He said the camera had seen something that shouldn't be seen, had recorded something that existed in spaces between what we call real. Robert finally looked at the photograph again, his eyes focusing on the dark figure. After Thomas disappeared, 2 more children in Salem went missing that summer. My grandfather closed the studio and moved the family to New York. He never took another photograph in his life, couldn't even look at a camera without shaking. Marcus had been taking notes throughout the conversation. Did he ever try to explain what he thought it was? This figure? Only once, when my father was older. My grandfather said that some places hold on to things. Traumas, deaths, dark emotions, Salem with its history. He thought that maybe the witch trials had left something behind. Not spirits exactly, but impressions, echoes. And somehow his camera in that specific room had the ability to capture those echoes on film. Eleanor felt a chill despite the warm sunroom. Did he ever go back? Try to investigate? No, he refused. But he told my father that if anyone ever found those photographs, they should burn them. Don't study them. Don't try to enhance them. Don't look too closely. Some things, he said, look back. The 3 of them sat in silence for a moment. Finally, Robert spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what's in that photograph. I don't know if it's real or if my grandfather had some kind of breakdown. But I'll tell you this. After Thomas Blackwell disappeared, after those other children went missing, the disappearances stopped, as if whatever it was had been satisfied. If you're still watching, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what we uncover next. Eleanor couldn't let it go. Back in Boston, she spent weeks poring over every detail of the photograph, reading everything she could find about Salem's history, about the Blackwell family, about the other missing children Robert had mentioned. She found them. 3 children in total, all disappeared between May and August 1913. Thomas Blackwell, age 9, Sarah Morrison, age 7, Daniel Cruz, age 11. All 3 cases remained unsolved, filed away in police archives and eventually forgotten. But it was what she found in Margaret Whitmore's estate inventory that changed everything. Buried in the list of items was a reference to property ownership. Deed to 47 Essex Street, Salem, Massachusetts, purchased 1945, Essex Street, where Jonathan Perkins had his photography studio. Eleanor drove to Salem on a grey November morning. The address corresponded to a narrow 3-story building that had been converted into apartments sometime in the 1970s. The current landlord, a tired-looking man named Vincent Romano, met her in the dusty entryway. "You're the historian who called?" Vincent asked, unlocking the front door. "I've owned this building for 12 years. Always meant to renovate it properly, but I don't know. Something about this place makes workers uncomfortable. They don't last long." He led her up to the 2nd floor. According to the old records, this was where the photography studio was. The main room here, with the big windows for natural light. Eleanor stepped into the space. It was empty now, stripped down to bare walls and old hardwood floors. The windows looked out onto Essex Street, allowing weak afternoon light to filter through. She could picture it easily, the camera on its tripod, the subjects posed carefully, Jonathan Perkins working with practiced efficiency. "Can I take some photographs?" Eleanor asked. Vincent shrugged. "Sure. Just lock up when you leave." "I've got to get back to my office." Alone in the room, Eleanor set up her digital camera on a tripod, positioning it where she estimated Perkins's camera would have been. The light was similar to what would have existed in 1913, though the surroundings had changed. She took several test shots of the empty room. Nothing unusual appeared on the digital display. Then she thought about what Robert Perkins had said. Only when certain people were in the frame. Eleanor set the camera's timer and stood in the approximate position where Thomas Blackwell had stood. She held up her phone as a stand-in for the toy soldier, forced a smile, and waited for the click. The photograph showed only her, standing alone in the room. Nothing in the background except old walls and windows. She was about to give up when she heard footsteps in the hallway. A young girl, maybe 8 years old, peeked into the room. "Are you taking pictures?" she asked. Eleanor's heart began to race. "Yes, I am. Do you live here?" "Downstairs with my mom. I'm Emma." "Emma, would you like to be in a photograph? Right here, where you're standing, is perfect." The girl smiled and struck a pose. Eleanor adjusted the camera, framed the shot, and clicked. When she looked at the digital display, her breath caught in her throat. There, in the background, barely visible in the corner of the room where shadows gathered despite the afternoon light, was a tall, thin shape. Not as clear as in the 1913 photograph, but unmistakably present. The same impossible proportions, the same sense of darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Did it come out good?" Emma asked, moving to look at the screen. Eleanor quickly turned off the display. "Yes, very nice. Thank you, Emma." The girl skipped away, and Eleanor was alone again. She looked at the corner where the figure had appeared. There was nothing there, just an empty space where 2 walls met. She took several more photographs of the empty room, from different angles, with different settings. In every shot where the camera was positioned where Perkins would have been and aimed at that corner, there was something. A shadow that shouldn't be there. A presence that the camera could see, but her eyes could not. Eleanor packed up her equipment with trembling hands. Before she left, she walked to that corner and stood there. The air felt different. Not colder exactly, but heavier. Like standing in a place where something terrible had happened, where the memory of darkness had soaked into the very walls. She thought about Margaret Whitmore, who had owned this building for decades. Had she known? Is that why she'd kept the photograph of Thomas Blackwell locked away? Back in her car, Eleanor sat for a long time before starting the engine. She had come to Salem looking for answers, but all she had found were more questions. What was the figure in the photograph? Why did it only appear when children were present? And most disturbing of all, was it still here? Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Have you seen the news? Another child reported missing in Salem. 9-year-old boy. I think you should come back to Boston." Eleanor's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She looked back at the building on Essex Street, at the second-floor windows, where the late afternoon sun created long shadows. The question wasn't whether something was there. The camera had proven that. The question was, what did it want? And after all these years of seeming inactivity, why had it started again? She thought about burning the photograph, as Robert Perkins had suggested, but she knew she wouldn't. Because now she understood what Jonathan Perkins must have felt in 1913, the terrible certainty that something was wrong, that something existed in the spaces between reality and perception, and that somehow, impossibly, his camera could see it. The sun was setting as Eleanor drove out of Salem. In her rear-view mirror, the town disappeared into gathering darkness. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Not by the figure in the photograph, but by the question itself, the unanswerable question that had haunted everyone who had ever seen that image. What was in the background of Thomas Blackwell's photograph? Was it something that had always been there, invisible to the naked eye, but captured by the camera's lens? Or was it something that the act of photographing had somehow called into being? Eleanor didn't know. She wasn't sure anyone could know. But as she drove through the New England twilight, she understood one thing with terrible clarity. The photograph had not captured a moment in the past. It had captured something that existed outside of time, something that watched and waited in the spaces where light and shadow met, and it was still watching. 3 weeks after Eleanor's visit to Salem, the missing boy, Kevin Martinez, was found safe, wandering near the harbor with no memory of where he'd been. His parents were relieved, the police were baffled, and the media moved on to other stories. But Eleanor couldn't move on. The photograph haunted her. Not in the supernatural sense, though she was beginning to question what that word even meant, but in the way that unresolved mysteries tend to occupy the spaces between waking thoughts and restless sleep. She found herself studying it at odd hours, zooming in on different sections, measuring shadow angles, comparing light sources, searching for some rational explanation that continued to elude her. She had made copies of the photograph, both the original from 1913 and the one she'd taken in the studio. She'd shown them to experts across multiple disciplines: photography, psychology, paranormal research, historical documentation, even quantum physics. Each one had a different explanation, and each explanation felt simultaneously convincing and insufficient. Dr. Sarah Chen, a cognitive psychologist at Boston University, had spent 2 hours examining the images in her office overlooking the Charles River. She'd pulled up dozens of examples on her computer screen: faces in clouds, figures in wood-grain patterns, religious imagery in toast. "Your brain wants to see something meaningful in the shadows," she explained, gesturing at the photographs spread across her desk. "Especially when you're primed to expect something unusual. It's called pareidolia, and it's an evolutionary adaptation. Our ancestors, who were quick to spot predators in the shadows, survived better than those who didn't. We're hardwired to see threats, to find patterns, to make sense of ambiguity." Eleanor had nodded, understanding the theory. But then she'd asked the question that Dr. Chen couldn't answer. Why does the figure appear in multiple photographs taken over 100 years apart, in exactly the same location, with exactly the same proportions? Dr. Chen had been silent for a long moment. That is harder to explain unless there's something about that specific space, the angle of the walls, the way light enters through the windows, that consistently creates this optical effect. But it only appears when children are in the frame, Eleanor had countered. I took dozens of test shots. Empty room, nothing. Adults in the frame, nothing. A child enters, and there it is. The psychologist had leaned back in her chair, clearly uncomfortable. Then we're moving beyond my area of expertise. I can explain pareidolia. I can't explain selective manifestation based on the age of the subject. Father Michael O'Brien, a Jesuit priest who had studied historical accounts of allegedly haunted locations for a documentary series, offered a different perspective. Eleanor met him at a small cafe in Cambridge, where he arrived with a worn leather satchel filled with books and notes. Salem's history is dark, he said, stirring sugar into his coffee. The witch trials, yes, but also the decades of fear and superstition that followed. The economic collapse of the early 1900s, the desperation. Places can hold on to that kind of pain. Whether you call it spiritual residue or collective trauma, something remains. He pulled out a notebook filled with cramped handwriting. I've documented over 300 cases of alleged hauntings. About 20% involve photography capturing things the naked eye cannot see, usually orbs, light anomalies, that sort of thing. But occasionally, he paused, finding a specific page. Occasionally, there are cases like yours. Consistent, repeatable, unexplainable. Do you think it's real? Eleanor asked. Actually real, not just a psychological phenomenon? Father O'Brien smiled sadly. I've been a priest for 30 years, Dr. Hayes. I believe in the soul, in life after death, in forces beyond our material world. But I'm also a rational man who understands that belief and proof are different things. What I can tell you is this: whether the figure in your photograph is a ghost, a dimensional anomaly, or a trick of light that we simply don't understand yet, it has an effect. It disappeared 3 children in 1913. It touched Kevin Martinez this year. Real or not, it has consequences. Yet even he admitted he had no explanation for why a camera could capture what the human eye could not. Professor James Hartford, a physicist specializing in optics and light at Northeastern University, had been the most intriguing interview. His laboratory was filled with equipment Eleanor couldn't begin to understand. Lasers, prisms, sensors measuring wavelengths she'd never heard of. There are documented cases of cameras capturing wavelengths of light outside the visible spectrum, he explained, adjusting a complex apparatus. Infrared, ultraviolet. Digital cameras can even pick up infrared from remote controls. Try it sometime. Point your TV remote at your phone camera and press a button. You'll see a light that's invisible to your naked eye. He'd examined the photographs under various types of light, used spectrographic analysis, measured shadow densities. The figure in your photograph absorbs light in a way that's inconsistent with normal shadow formation. It's more like a black body in physics terms, something that absorbs all wavelengths, but that shouldn't be possible in a naturally lit room. Unless what? Eleanor had pressed. Unless what we're seeing is something that exists beyond our normal perception of light and space. Not supernatural, just natural in a way we don't yet understand. There are theoretical models in quantum physics about parallel dimensions, about spaces that exist adjacent to ours. Most physicists consider them mathematical abstractions. But what if they're not? What if certain conditions, certain places, certain configurations of space and light allow us brief glimpses into these adjacent spaces? And what if cameras, being mechanical eyes without the filtering bias of human consciousness, can record what our minds refuse to see? Eleanor had left each interview more confused than before. Science offered possibilities, but no certainties. Faith offered comfort, but no proof. The photograph remained what it had always been, a question without an answer. She found herself caught between rationality and something deeper. She was a historian, trained to deal in facts and evidence, to construct narratives from documentation and testimony. But the evidence in this case pointed toward something that shouldn't exist according to the orderly universe she'd been taught to believe in. Unable to sleep one cold December night, Eleanor returned to Margaret Whitmore's estate. The remaining items that hadn't yet been catalogued sat in boxes in the society's storage facility, waiting for spring when they'd have more staff to process everything. But Eleanor had keys, and she had questions. In a small wooden box, buried beneath old clothes and costume jewelry, she found letters, dozens of them, written over decades, all addressed to Margaret from various people. Eleanor carried the box to her office, made coffee, and began to read as snow fell silently outside her window. The letters told a story she hadn't expected. Margaret Whitmore hadn't just owned the building on Essex Street, she had been obsessed with it. The correspondence spanned from the 1940s to the early 2000s, documenting a lifetime spent trying to understand what had happened there. There were letters from former residents of Salem, elderly people sharing memories of 1913. There were responses from paranormal investigators she'd hired in the 1970s, most dismissive, a few genuinely disturbed. There were exchanges with historians, physicists, even a letter from a Harvard professor of philosophy discussing the nature of reality and perception. But it was a letter from 1967, written by Margaret herself, but apparently never sent, that revealed the truth of her obsession. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but the words were still clear. I was 7 years old in 1913, living on Essex Street with my aunt, while my mother recovered from pneumonia in a sanatorium. I knew Thomas Blackwell. We played together sometimes in the summer, sharing marbles and stories in the small yard behind his building. I remember the day he showed me his photograph, the one with the toy soldier. He was so proud of it. His father had taken him to Perkins Photography, and Thomas thought he looked very grown up in the picture. He showed it to all the children on the street. But I remember being frightened by something in that picture, even though I couldn't say what it was. Just a feeling of wrongness, like when you smell smoke but can't find the fire. 3 days later, Thomas was gone. I was interviewed by the police, as were all the children who knew him. They asked if he'd seemed upset, if he'd talked about running away, if he'd been in trouble. But Thomas was happy. He loved his father, loved his toy soldier, loved the summer afternoons when we'd play. He had no reason to disappear. They never found him. The police searched for weeks, then months, then moved on to other cases. But I kept having dreams about that photograph. In the dreams, I could see what was in the background clearly. It was tall and thin and dark, and it was reaching toward Thomas. Not with hands. It didn't have hands in the way we understand them, but with something that looked like shadows, given intention and purpose. I told my aunt about the dreams. She dismissed them as childish fears, but I couldn't let it go. Even after I moved away from Salem, even after I married and built a life in Boston, I thought about Thomas, about the photograph, about the thing in the background that I could feel but couldn't see. When I was 53 years old, I came into an inheritance from my husband's estate. I used it to buy the building on Essex Street. My adult children thought I was mad. Perhaps I was, but I needed to understand. I've spent my life trying to understand what happened. I hired investigators, both scientific and paranormal. I've researched the building's history back to its construction in 1887. I've interviewed everyone still living who remembered that summer of 1913. I've studied photography, optics, psychology, even dabbled in quantum physics, though the math is beyond me. I've stood in that second-floor room hundreds of times. Sometimes I feel nothing, but other times, usually in the late afternoon, when the light comes through the windows at a certain angle, I feel something. A presence that doesn't belong to our world, but touches it somehow, like a shadow cast by something we can't see, from a direction that doesn't exist in our three-dimensional space. I don't know if Thomas is dead, or if something took him somewhere we can't follow. I don't know if the figure in the photograph is real in the way we understand reality, or if it's something our minds create to explain the inexplicable. I only know that it's there. I've felt it. And I believe that the camera, being a mechanical observer without consciousness or fear, can record what it sees without the filtering that our minds perform automatically to keep us sane. I will keep this photograph locked away. I will keep the building, though it costs me money I don't have, because I believe that some mysteries are meant to be witnessed but not solved. Some questions exist not to be answered, but to remind us that the universe is larger and stranger than our limited perception allows. If you're reading this, whoever you are, you've found the photograph. You're asking the same questions I asked, and you'll come to the same realization I did. There are no answers, only the photograph and the question it poses, and the uncomfortable possibility that we share our world with things we cannot see, but which can, under certain circumstances, see us. Eleanor sat in the archive reading room as dawn light began to filter through the windows, Margaret's letter in her hands, and finally understood there would be no definitive answer. The photograph of Thomas Blackwell would remain what it had always been, a question posed in silver and shadow, a mystery that existed in the uncertain space between belief and skepticism. She thought about Kevin Martinez, the boy who had gone missing and returned with no memory. She'd visited his family, spoken to him briefly. He was a normal 9-year-old boy, playing video games and complaining about homework. But his mother had told Eleanor something disturbing. He won't go near Essex Street anymore. We used to cut through there on the way to the library. Now he refuses, says the buildings watch him. She thought about Emma, the little girl who had posed for her photograph in the old studio. Eleanor had tried to find her again, to show her parents the image, but Vincent Romano had no tenant matching that description. No one named Emma lived in the building. No one with a daughter that age. She thought about all the children who had lived in Salem over the decades, walking past that building on Essex Street, never knowing what might be watching from within. The rational part of Eleanor's mind wanted to dismiss it all. Coincidence, pareidolia, mass hysteria fed by Salem's dark history and the lingering cultural memory of the witch trials. But she had seen the photographs. She had stood in that room and felt the weight of its presence. She had felt the way the air seemed different in that corner, heavier somehow, as if space itself was compressed or folded in ways that violated normal geometry. And she knew that some questions don't have answers. They only have witnesses. She made a decision. She would publish her findings, but not as a definitive statement. Instead, she would present the photograph, the history, the testimonies, and let others draw their own conclusions. She would add Margaret Whitmore's letter, Robert Perkins's account, and her own experience in the studio. She would be honest about what could be explained and what could not. She would acknowledge the limitations of both skepticism and belief. The article appeared in the Journal of American Historical Studies 3 months later, in the spring of 2020. It was titled Shadows and Silver, an Unexplained Anomaly in Early 20th Century Photography. It documented everything Eleanor had found, presenting the facts without claiming to explain them. She included high-resolution scans of both photographs, transcripts of her interviews, excerpts from Margaret's letters, and a careful analysis of what was known and what remained mysterious. The response was immediate and divided. Skeptics pointed to camera artifacts, psychological factors, the power of suggestion, and the human tendency to see patterns in randomness. They published response articles with titles like Pareidolia and Historical Photography, a case study, and the psychology of perceived anomalies in archival images. Believers saw proof of the paranormal, evidence that the veil between worlds was thinner than science acknowledged. Paranormal forums erupted with discussions. YouTube videos analyzed every pixel of the photograph. People began visiting Salem specifically to see the building on Essex Street, though Eleanor had deliberately not published the exact address. Most people simply found it unsettling, a glimpse into the possibility that the world contained more than what our eyes could see. The article went viral in academic circles, then spread to mainstream media. Eleanor did interviews for podcasts, radio shows, even a documentary crew that wanted to recreate the photograph. She declined most requests. This wasn't about fame or proof. It was about documentation, about preserving a mystery for future generations who might have better tools or deeper understanding. Eleanor kept the original photograph locked in the archive vault with strict access controls and environmental monitoring to preserve it. She made one more copy for herself, which she kept in a drawer in her office. Sometimes, when she worked late and the building was quiet, she would take it out and study it again. The boy with his innocent smile and his toy soldier, the dark figure in the background, always watching, always present in that impossible way. She never returned to the building on Essex Street. Vincent Romano had called her once, asking if she'd be interested in purchasing it. "I can't keep it," he'd said. "The tenants don't stay long. Strange things happen. Electronics malfunction. People report feeling watched." One woman swore she saw a tall shadow standing in her living room, though there was nothing there when the lights came on. "I'm losing money. I need to sell." Eleanor had politely declined. Some places, she decided, were better left undisturbed. Some doors, once opened, were better left closed. But on certain nights when the wind rattled her windows and shadows moved in the corners of her vision, Eleanor would think about Thomas Blackwell. She would wonder where he had gone, what he had seen in those final moments, whether the figure in the photograph had taken him somewhere or simply erased him from existence, like a photograph exposed to light. And she would think about Margaret Whitmore's words, "Some things exist in the spaces between our understanding." The photograph remained in the archive, a testament to the unexplainable. Researchers occasionally requested to see it, adding their own theories to the growing collection. A physicist from MIT spent 3 days analyzing it and published a paper suggesting it might be evidence of gravitational lensing from a localized spatial distortion. A neuroscientist from Yale argued it was proof that consciousness itself could imprint on physical media. A folklorist from Brown University connected it to older Salem legends about thin places where the boundary between worlds grew permeable. But no one could prove what it showed. No one could definitively say whether the dark figure was real or imagined, supernatural or natural, dangerous or merely watching. The mystery of Thomas Blackwell's photograph endured, not as a solved case, but as a question that would never be answered. A reminder that for all our science and rationality, for all our telescopes and microscopes and mathematical models, there are still corners of reality that remain shrouded in shadows. And in those shadows, something watches. Something that cameras can see, but eyes cannot. Something that has been there since 1913, or perhaps much longer. Waiting in the space between light and darkness, reality and perception, the known and the unknowable. Eleanor sometimes wondered if Jonathan Perkins had been right to burn his photographs, if Margaret Whitmore had been wise to lock hers away, if some knowledge was too dangerous to seek. But she was a historian. Documentation was her calling, even when the documents revealed things that shouldn't be possible. The photograph remains, and the question remains, and perhaps that is all the answer we will ever get. A boy smiling with his toy soldier, frozen in silver nitrate and time. A dark figure in the background, reaching across dimensions or emerging from our own shadows. A mystery that refuses to be solved, because perhaps some mysteries exist not to be understood, but to remind us that understanding has limits. And sometimes, late at night in the archive, when Eleanor is alone with old photographs and older questions, she thinks she understands what Thomas Blackwell might have seen in his final moments. Not a monster or a ghost, but something far stranger, a glimpse beyond the boundaries of what we call real, into spaces that exist alongside our world, separated by barriers so thin that sometimes, under the right conditions, they can be breached. Or perhaps she understands nothing at all, and the figure is exactly what it appears to be, a shadow in an old photograph, given meaning by minds desperate to find patterns in darkness. The photograph remains. The question remains. And in Salem, on Essex Street, in a building that no one wants to buy and no one wants to enter, that second-floor room waits in perpetual afternoon light, holding its secrets in corners, where shadows gather even when there's nothing to cast them. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear what you think really happened to Thomas Blackwell and whether you believe what the camera captured was real. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next mysterious story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.